So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me for the Scholarly Communications webinar titled Open Access from the Author's Perspective. So for today's webinar, this is a follow-up from the one we hosted 2 weeks ago that gave an overview of the open access publishing model. So the ins and outs of how the publishing model works. This webinar is going to be a panel discussion with 5 faculty from MCW who have experience publishing in this model, and they'll share their experiences and the practicalities of how it works and how they choose where to publish their journal articles. I'll give each panelist 5 to 10 minutes to present on their experiences, and then we'll open it up for questions. If questions come up throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them into chat, and we will address them as best we can. So presenting today is Dr. Christina Runge, who is the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs and a professor in the Department of Otolaryngology and Communication Sciences. We've got Dr. Jonathan Marchant, who is the chair and professor of cell biology, neurobiology, and anatomy. Also presenting is Dr. Bilal Abid, who's an assistant professor of medicine in hematology and oncology and infectious diseases. Dr. Timothy Meier, Associate Professor of Neurosurgery, will be presenting, as well as Dr. Sebastian Linde, Associate Professor in Medicine, the Division of General Internal Medicine. So we'll start today with discussion from Dr. Marchant, if he wants to lead us off, and then we'll move on from there. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great, thanks, Liz. It's nice to be here today with the panelists. So I think going to hear some views on experiences with open access, and I'm at the basic researcher end of the spectrum, so I can talk a little bit about our views from our lab about our experiencing with publishing and how we select journals, which journals to send our research to. I run a basic research lab. We have one wing of it works on pediatric infectious disease. So we are interested in several neglected diseases of poverty. And I'm bringing this up because I think it's relevant to something I'm going to say subsequently in open access. And then we have sort of a basic signal transduction side of our lab. And I guess I represent very much the sort of conservative, slow to change researcher in the contents of open access, in the sense that we still approach publication through several criteria, which doesn't really necessarily grasp all the benefits of open access as we should, the free to read, free to reuse. So I would say this: when we're looking to select where to publication, we're still somewhat dinosaur-like, largely driven by research funding. So we're looking for journals that are perceived to be very high quality and highly influential. As you know, where can this research go that probably is driven by impact factor rather than necessarily access? That's the reality, and we can probably have a proactive panel discussion about that. Probably after that, we then look at elements of fit, you know, which journals are best appropriate for a particular type of research. And these might be quite specialist journals where we know, well, these findings will be of particular interest to these particular people in our field. And they could still, unfortunately, be subscription journals, but we probably still think the benefits of publishing them there for their audience is where the research is going to be best received. And then we do come to open access. And as I said at the start, we do work on several diseases of poverty. And this is quite an important element because in low to middle income countries that are relevant to our research, many academic institutions there aren't paying subscription fees to journals or don't have access. So if we want our figures or our reviews or the impact of our research to be widely seen and widely reused in the communities where it can have most impact, then open access is definitely a priority. And we're somewhat fortunate in talking through those priorities of research impact, research fit, and then research availability. We are well served by some good new open access journals in that space. Public Library of Science being the prime example, where they have PLOS pathogens, PLOS neglected tropical diseases that sort of fit all those buckets and ring all those bells. So I think the challenges that we do face is that for the basic end of research enterprise, we're still largely driven by funding, and securing and maintaining funding is a major determinant of where we select to publish. I do think that's changing because of all the advantages of open access, the ease of digitization, the ease of use of getting findings into an open access journal, the ridiculous subscription rates that many journals charge. I mean, I think it's just not sustainable for libraries to keep up with some of these annual fees. I mean, I think some of the chemistry journals, I think there's one tetrahedron which is like $40,000 a year to subscribe to, and it's not feasible. From the researcher's perspective, I think the barriers, though, are finding funding and the fees to get into open access where fees are charged. And certainly as a department chair, I frequently have faculty coming to me to ask, well, we want to go open access, but we want to have to pay this author processing charge in either hybrid journals or in some of the open access journals. So I think it's a barrier, and I think institutionally we've got to get our head around as to how to help faculty publish in journals that are freely available to all. It is taxpayer funded research after all, and I think there's no point in having science that is not available because it's not impacting that person at a patient's bedside who wants to look something up on Medline and can't get access to it. And I think it's something that we should begin to have conversations with our trainees about, also about, you know, how do they feel about where they want to publish, and the motivation to make sure that their research is freely available. I think many funding bodies, not necessarily NIH, but certainly in other countries, do provide financial support for open access, and will pay those charges either as a supplement to grant funding or as a dedicated line item when you apply for grants. And I don't think we're quite there yet with many of our agencies. So I'm gonna shut up. That was my initial thoughts about, from the basic side of the spectrum, how I approach where to publish. And it's hard to, open access is a great thing, but I think still we have some logistical challenges in fully embracing it as bench scientists.
Thank you for your perspective. Can I put you on the spot and ask, as a chair, when somebody approaches you from your department asking for funding, what advice do you give to them?
Well, we lift every sofa cushion and try and find whatever change we can, and to ensure that they can meet these open access fees. I mean, I think most labs, to their credit, try and stump up their funds themselves, but grant budgets are tight. The modular NIH budget hasn't changed in a very long time, and people do struggle to find their fees, and it does impact where they publish. A lot of faculty are embracing bioarchives, for instance, preprint servers, although there are some instances of research that people don't want to put on preprint servers because of risks of being, you know, having data scooped until it's been formally accepted at one of the highly influential journals. That's free, so that's an option that many faculty are doing, but it's not applicable to all cases, especially when the research is, you know, in that scoopable bucket.
Thank you. We'll transition now to Dr. Runge.
Great, thank you, Liz. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our research and our journal selections. So my research, I have a couple different arms. One, I do have a clinical research program. So it's human subjects research in hearing, in cochlear implants, in hearing aids, those sorts of things, very translational, designed to go right from the clinic to recommendations and best practices for evidence-based medicine. And then other research that I do, which is more basic science, animal preclinical research. And what our journal selection process. Our field of hearing is very small. So otolaryngology isn't the biggest field, but then you start breaking it down into all its own subspecialties. You start getting into otology and then audiology. It gets narrower, and then your audience becomes really, really key. So a lot of what I do for the clinical research is put it in journals that are mostly for societies. And so the journal for the American Academy of Audiology, for example, will go right to clinical audiologists. So if I'm doing hearing aid research, new clinical protocols for that research based, then it can go there. Otology, neurotology is another one. So that's where I tend to go to, not so much that I actually tend to avoid the subscription journals, to be honest. If they're not going to be directly in people's hands and they have to subscribe through their institution, I kind of shy away from, I've been shying away from those. And so in the open access, the one that comes to mind that we recently published was actually an animal study. And we chose open access because I was working with Dr. Nancy Doms, and it's in the dark agouti rat strain and looking at hearing loss in that rat strain. And no one had characterized hearing loss in that. So we kind of were basically publishing normative data for this particular animal model that has could be used for a lot of different types of research, and with different organ systems, has a few different things going on. So we thought it would be more broadly applicable, could be used as, again, as normative data for anyone who wants to research anything using this kind of animal model in this particular strain. We also want to encourage people to know about this strain and how they might be able to use it. And so again, we really were thinking it's hearing loss, or, we characterize the hearing over time. So we characterize it by the age of the animal. But what's interesting too is other fields would be impacted by the hearing of an animal. So for example, some research uses in addiction or depression or some other things might use a startle response, which is animals jumping to a loud sound. But if the animal has hearing loss and they don't know it, that'll change the startle response because the sound won't be that loud, they won't startle, and they might misinterpret the results. So something that's more broadly applicable to the scientific field is how we chose this. To publish open access for that particular study. As far as paying for it, since it was sort of a team-based science approach, Dr. Doms and I split the cost of what for that open access, and we use some grant funding, and then Dr. Rhee is supportive as well. So I'm one of those who goes to the department chair and say, can I have a little bit? We're going to split the cost of this. So that's how we do it. What I might mention to faculty as well, one source of income or revenue, if you will, that I use is I have some unrestricted funds that I use for unfunded research expenses, such as open access publishing, through doing consultation with different companies and things. So there's a lot of different opportunities as faculty. So I've done some legal work and again, some consulting, and you can actually do that through MCW, and it goes directly into an account that then you can use for such expenses like this. So that's another opportunity for faculty they may not be aware of. You want to make sure and check with your department chair and then Office of Corporate Compliance, and make sure you're just compliant with all of the policies that we have around that. But that's another opportunity to sort of have a little bit of funding available for these sorts of expenses.
One question that I have for you is, so your goal is to get this into the provider's hands as easily as possible. Do you see any evidence that that's happening? Do you get any feedback, or are you able to measure that in any way?
That's such a great question, Liz, and that would be, I could certainly go and look at downloads and access. I think the journals are becoming a little bit better with providing some of that information, but that's a great question. Normally you look at how often it's referenced, but I think nowadays we would be able to look and see how often it's accessed and read. Such things like if you put it in ResearchGate, if you can, put these things out there, or because it used to be, remember I used to get boxes of reprints, right? Who remembers that? Yeah. dinosaur. Who are the other dinosaurs? You remember that? So boxes of reprints, and you'd mail them to people, right? So that's how we used to measure that. But now it's digital, and I get a lot of outreach. And I've actually had some people reach out to me as one of the corresponding authors about sharing this animal model. So I know it's being accessed and read from that perspective too. But that's a really good point, Liz. And actually, what I would do is ask the librarians, can you help us with that? How would you recommend we get that information? And is it more robust data that we could get from open access versus some of the subscription journals? Because that would be a benefit then if it's something, and since we're paying for something, that might be something we want to ask for, is that they give us some metrics on the access of it.
Those are good questions for the library staff as well. And there's different places you could look for that kind of metrics, but one benefit to publishing in open access is the copyright is yours. So you're able to post it in places like ResearchGate, where people can get to it and you can then view the downloads. And the journals are being a little more, they're making available a lot of those metrics and alt metrics and things like that on their web pages. So you can directly see how it's being accessed, how it's being talked about on the internet and things like that. So thank you very much. We'll move on to Dr. Abid, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions. So,
Liz, thank you for having me. So I will touch upon three things in terms of practical and real world aspects of open access publishing, and then primarily building up upon what prior discussants have presented this morning. So before I do that, there are two things that I would want to share with our audience this morning. My area of focus of now I do clinical research. Previously, I spent some time in the lab. I was a basic scientist for 3 years in between residency training and the two fellowships, clinical fellowships that I did. Now I work on a narrow area, and that allows me to stay focused on a narrow group of medical journals. So journals are pretty much pre-selected when our group submits to them. And we have prior conversations with the editorial board or editor-in-chief or the associate editor or whoever is related to the work at hand. So I think first of all, quickly sharing my own opinion, which may or may not be accurate. I personally believe that open access is a phenomenal thing. There are myths associated with it. And every open access, simply as a junior investigator, I always thought that open access means money. What that is not true. Barely about a fourth of open access involves our APC, article processing charge, and the rest comes from various other sources. And with the publications that I have done, I've only had to pay out of pocket once. I'm not sure how many publications I have, but that was about last year, and that too, it was 2020 late, and it was it turned out to be a highly citable article. I was a senior author on that. And that too, I had a personal conversation with the editor-in-chief, sharing with them, look, I have 2 small children, I have to buy diapers, I have to do this and that. And what he did, he cut the standard $3,000 article processing charge to half. So in-person community, in personal level conversations help. That article has now been cited more than 100 times in less than a year, a little more than a year. So it's, in my opinion, open access is great. It's good for the investigator, it's good for the institution, and it has a global good attached to it. So moving forward, I will share what an investigator could do from a practical standpoint, from getting away and preventing fraud while publishing open access. So when we go open access, as with everything else, there's fraud attached to open access publishing. Every morning, investigators get a number of emails inviting them in a very generic manner, and not even specifying the last name, sometimes even just saying, "Greetings, Professor, please submit to that. We're short of one article." So it's over a period of time, one is able to identify what's a genuine invitation from a known journal versus what we call a predatory invitation. So that's important from a practical standpoint to tell apart. Some of the standard ways for early career investigators to tell apart a genuine invitation versus an invitation from a predatory journal would be, start using Think, Check, Submit, JCR, Simago, go through the journal's website and see if they have an editorial board lined up, and you can find the editor-in-chief and his or her publications, track record. So that's important. You find a way, go through certain portals, certain routes, and find a way which you're comfortable with in telling apart authentic open access versus predatory publishing invitations. The third thing I wanted to touch upon is post-publication, and that's, well, quickly tying pre and post-publication together. So I have not had enough experience with preprints. The only time our group of investigators submitted one of our articles as a preprint, it was picked up through a social media portal by an editor of a reputable journal, and we were invited to submit to that journal. And that was beyond the level of my expectation. Once we start working, results, we do analysis, results come out, and once the results come out, and any investigator would know where this specific research publication is going to land, whether we're going to a tier 1 journal or a tier 2 journal or a tier 3 journal. Now, this was in my mind was a tier 3 or tier 2 publication, but it ended up in a tier 1 journal. So that's my only experience with preprint. Now, the other part that I learned along the way is that although I was under the impression that preprints get a DOI and they account towards citations, standard citations. Obviously, there are ways to track citations also. So DOI or preprints do not count towards peer-reviewed publication citations. So that's one thing that I learned along the way. Now, in terms of post-publication, as important for a busy clinician researcher like we all are, we have professional commitments. We are spread thin in several different dimensions. It's hard to keep a track of post-publication dissemination of the work. Now, when the hard work has been put in to conduct the study, write the results in a meaningful manner, and then take the time and be patient with a number of reviews back and forth, and then the publication comes out. It is equally important to share that for an investigator. This is besides the global good and equity and all of those things. So for the group of investigators, for junior investigators to build the academic repute for him or herself and the institution, it's important that the work is visible. So I was not an avid user of, for example, Twitter. I became one during COVID-19 pandemic. And it was more than just disseminating your work. I had learned a lot of ideas. We exchanged, we make consortiums, we achieved a lot through this one specific social medium in the last 2 years. The other is knowing how to use other avenues such as academia.edu, such as ResearchGate. These are excellent dissemination avenues. But a few years ago, what I did personally did, and I learned from that. I would just upload every single publication that I had into ResearchGate without knowing the regulations behind. Really, I never probably bothered to look into Creative Commons license and what I'm authorized to do, what I'm not authorized to do. To learn that, Sherpa Romeo is a great resource. And I think going into the detail of that is probably beyond the scope of this morning's discussion. I will, however, refer the listeners to Elizabeth's last video. I had a chance to listen to that, and that really covers all of those fundamental aspects. Phenomenally beautiful learning session that was. Last but not the least, I just can't, I wish I had a better advice for journal selection. I would say that I'm not a good advisor in that regard, primarily because I work at the intersection of hematology, oncology, but specifically intersection of cellular therapy, stem cell transplantation, and infectious diseases. This is what these two disciplines is what I practice clinically. So journals are pretty much pre-selected, really. And I've not had a chance to go outside of that narrow. I will stop here and see if people have any questions.
One question that I have is, do you find that your field is limited due to is your choice of journals limited because you have a focus on open access? Like, how does your field represented as far as availability of open access journals?
I've not had an issue. Like I said, I think I've not had to pay even once for open access, except for one time last year. Sorry, this is my daughter who's excited this morning. So our institution gets subscription for the journals that I submit to. A few times funding agencies have required that we publish open access. Now, in that case, the grant funding is utilized for publication costs in open access. I've not had to personally pay outside of that.
Thank you. And I think there's a small glitch, so we'll move on to Dr. Meier.
Hi, thanks for letting me be a part of the panel. It's been interesting hearing everybody else's experiences. So I do human subjects research. We study mild traumatic brain injury using MRI and blood-based biomarkers and obviously clinical data. So our journals are, we range from sports medicine journals sometimes, if it's in athletes, to neurology journals or psychiatry journals. And we have done, we have good experience with using open access journals. Some of the imaging journals have actually shifted to completely being open access. So for example, human brain mapping, which is a usual target. The only option is open access now. I don't really have any horror stories either way, working as a reviewer or as someone who's published in open access. Obviously, certain pros and cons are pretty evident. At least in our field, there's certainly, you have to be careful of the predatory journals, but there are very well-respected journals that are open access, and I'm happy to go to them. One nice thing about the open access journals is some of the subscription journals or non-open access journals, they kind of put the burden on the authors to put your paper into PubMed Central. So when you publish open access, it's nice, this is kind of just taken care of. It's not something else you have to worry about after the paper's already been accepted. And I guess I do have one anecdote about open access giving you more exposure for a paper. So we had 2 papers published in the same year, very similar papers, different cohorts, but basically showing the same thing. And we published one in JAMA Network Open, and we published one in Annals of Neurology. If you're going by impact factor, Annals of Neurology is, a quote unquote better journal. But what's been interesting is that the JAMA Network Open paper has almost 3 times as many citations. Now, I don't know if that's just because of the open access, but it's kind of an interesting observation. Obviously, the downsides is it's more expensive. Most of the journals that we're going to, it's like $3,000. So you either have to have some money, from the grant set aside for that, or you can go and ask the department. I guess, I try to limit how many asks I have or I send to the department, but it's obviously an option. And when choosing journals, this has been covered pretty well, but really you're considering the audience, the impact factor, and I do actually consider the cost. That's because most of the stuff that we do is funded by the NIH. So I know that eventually it's going to be in PubMed Central, no matter where I publish it. So in that sense, frankly, the open access journals aren't usually my top choice, just because I know that after that embargo period, that paper will be widely available. Yeah, and I'm also kind of curious to see how the preprints change things. I haven't done that yet, but if we were to have something that I really wanted to get out, very quickly, I think it was interesting during COVID, right? All these preprints, you get this rapid information for really important science right away. I mean, the stuff we're doing, it's more characterizing longer term effects, and these aren't things that are immediately going to impact clinical care. So at least in my opinion, there's not a huge rush to get that data out. But if there were, I would probably go to preprint route, and then for the publication, just still stick with the traditional journals, honestly. Things like neurology and JAMA Neurology and stuff like that, if possible.
So before, when we were talking, I mentioned that, sometimes you submit to a traditional journal and they might say, not here necessarily, but we have this sister publication. Would you consider submitting to that, and it's an open access one? How do you deal with that when you get that kind of feedback from a journal?
It irks me. It depends on how much I believe in the paper. If usually I don't follow through on that, I usually say, no, we're going to submit it somewhere else. We've done it a couple of times, but usually, especially it depends how much you believe in the paper. I try to go to another journal that's similar impact as the one that we had just submitted to. So yeah, I don't know. Cynically, it's always kind of annoyed me when you get the reviews and they're like, hey, we liked your paper. It's not good enough for neurotrauma, but it would be good enough for neurotrauma reports, for $3,000. That I'm usually not inclined to say, yeah, go ahead and do that.
Completely understandable. I think everybody on the panel from their smiles seem to agree with your statement. We'll end with Dr. Linde providing his experiences and anecdotes, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the opportunity to be here today and filling in for Dr. Walker. So I'll share some personal experiences from the perspective of a junior faculty member. I've been here 2 years now, and from someone who is interdisciplinary, with my primary area being health economics. So I'm affiliated with the Center for Advancing Population Science here at MCW. And prior to coming here, I transitioned from an economics department. So I'll try to kind of reflect on some of that as I kind of talk about, I think, mainly 4 things. Just firstly, kind of how to choose journals and how we've been doing that in our group, some of the benefits, the challenges, and potential alternatives at the end. So I think in terms of the choice of journal, that has been covered pretty well by everyone in terms of the panel. It's fairly similar for us. I think the number one metric that really stands out is the impact factor. And the second one is the appropriateness for the actual readership of the journal. And for someone in kind of health economics, for me, that usually kind of boils down to whether or not I feel that this is more for a kind of health or economics type of audience, or if it's more for the medical field type of audience. That's the biggest choice. And then usually within that area, it's fairly clear what journals to go for based on impact and the focus of the journal. For the benefits that have been mentioned, I think, like, just thinking more broadly, we had some of the panelists mention in terms of kind of working in the field of international health and so forth. And there's a lot of people in our group here that work with health disparities and that in a global setting too. So I think it's really important to kind of emphasize the fact that open access does open access not only here in the United States, but does so globally. And I've personally seen that in some of the work that I've published open access with people from outside, kind of citing some of the work. So that's been one thing that I've noticed in my own kind of experience. The other thing is also with regards to these walls as a barrier for kind of accessing work. Maybe I've experienced this a little bit more than others, depending because of my field. And it's because now I'm kind of in a medical setting. And if I try to read some journals in economics, for example, I might run into paywalls in some situations. So that's a situation where preprints might come in handy, and preprints that might have kind of a stamp of approval of certain organizations. So in economics, for instance, there's the National Bureau of Economic Research. So preprints are not always weighted the same. Preprints with kind of that backing might be weighed more heavily or be very highly cited by the time they actually are published. So that might be alternative avenues for accessing work, even though you might have the barrier with regards to not being able to access the journal right when you want to. If you're working in terms of what a lot of people do here too, in terms of public health or potentially looking at policy impacts and so forth, that might have interest for a lay audience too, that might be a benefit of open access in terms of that being able to be disseminated faster, and not just within your research community, but kind of a broader audience as a possibility. As well as work in terms of doing implementation work, getting that to people that actually use it on the day-to-day basis, like NGOs or other practitioners. That might be important. Just from talking to colleagues, one of the kind of key barriers with open access publications, for instance, people doing quality improvement work, is that that's naturally something that if you find a huge way to improve quality quickly that you want to disseminate very broadly, and that's a situation where kind of going the narrow route of a particular journal might be a hindrance, and that funding might not always be readily available within the health system. So those are potential barriers. But I think there are certain important things that kind of reduce those challenges, and several panelists have kind of mentioned this already, but the fact that if you have research funds that are able to support your research, and regardless of where you're actually publicizing that, it will end up in the Library of Medicine, and which is an incredible resource. But with that, often you will have the embargo period, and that varies depending on the journal, and that might delay the dissemination of that work, but still the fact that might be publicly available at some point is a huge benefit. But that's tied to this grant funding. And when that's not available, in my experience, I have been lucky enough to work with people that have the grant funding to support the work. I've also been the one asking the chair for some additional resources or applying for that when it's made public within the organization, and had very positive experiences with that. So there are ways to find those resources if you look. It just takes a little bit of time and might present a little bit of a barrier, but in my experience, that's been possible to overcome. So I think I'll pause there.
Thank you. And a question for you is multidisciplinary, finding like the right audience in that. Do you lean towards a more open multidisciplinary journal, or do you, you mentioned that sometimes you look at who the reader should be, whether it's medical versus more the administrative side?
Yeah, so I'll have, our group will usually have kind of journals in separate buckets. There'll be some where we're doing policy work and we want to have a readership that is kind of policymakers. So for example, getting a publication in Health Affairs might be an appropriate outlet for that group. If it's more of a technical paper, and perhaps it's with regards to methodology that is primarily used in the discipline of kind of economics, then that will primarily be kind of targeted maybe more towards like an econometric journal or an applied econometrics journal. But other work that is applied in nature will tend to kind of go for a more general medical audience. Is usually where our work falls, because we work with a lot with kind of health disparities and policies that might alleviate some of those disparities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll open it up to questions. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or put it into the chat. Okay, there is a question in chat and I'm going to go ahead and read it. So it's available on the recording. So the question is, obviously this group is pro-open access, but do you feel like MCW as an institution is pro-open access? Do you have experience with institutions that are very supportive with open access publishing, or the opposite, or anti-open access? So I'll leave it open. I'm not sure if anyone wants to take this. The first part of the question is, do you feel like MCW as an institution supports this? Each person coming from different departments might have different answers to this, so it'll be interesting to hear.
I'll jump in and go first. I think it's difficult to generalize here. I think this is an evolving landscape. I mean, I think with the existence of preprint servers, then it doesn't really become an institutional problem about providing funds for open access. The issue about preprint servers is that to some extent they are, well, they're not reviewed, right? So I think we're going to see again in the evolving landscape, you know, is there going to be a trend from publishing data to publishing politicized data? And we've seen a little bit about that happening over the last year. Obviously, there's no centralized fund at our institution for supporting open access. I mean, that is something that we should have a narrative about and see if we can be more supportive of it. I think those institutions that do support publication fees for open access are probably those institutions that have a significant endowment that they put behind it, or that they're forced by their funding agencies to be compliant from the get-go. And I think that's probably going to be the driver of change across institutions across the country, is an expectation from all funding agencies that fees are paid for and research is available instantaneously. So I don't think MCW is necessarily an outlier or necessarily bad. I think the drivers are a little bit more complex. And we're part of an evolution here into getting researchers to embrace getting science to the public as quickly as possible.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. If I might jump in here too. So I'm kind of also looking at this from the perspective as I'm an associate editor for the journal Otology and Neurotology, and they're one of those that also has an open access version to it. So it's never designed to be offensive if we offer someone to and what's interesting, it's Otology and Neurotology is the parent journal, and then Otology Neurotology Open is the open access, and the acronym is Oh No, which we joke about, but so it's actually, I haven't heard from the editorial side that there's a difference amongst institutions. I was just trying to think, because I've really, to be honest, I've only been at MCW for my whole career, but I'm not hearing for our open access platform from the journal side that there seems to be some institutions more supportive than others, or we can't if they're at Hopkins or something like that. I'm not hearing that, but it's an interesting question and something that I could certainly take back and see if there's some sort of difference, if there's an institutional aspect to supporting or not supporting that kind of publication.
Chris, can I be rude and just jump in, because I'm going to tweak you a little bit, because another hat you wear is in managing and overseeing rank and tenure. So maybe another element of Haley's question about whether the institution is pro open access is the rank and tenure process going to be pro open access? So how are you going to deal with preprints that are in preprint servers that have not landed, for instance, in final journals? Are we going to support our faculty doing that? I mean, I think there is more adaptation of that. It evidences progress in NIH progress reports that preprints count. So I think there is a trend of more of that happening. But again, we're dealing with structural elements about how we evaluate faculty and rank and tenure, that if you don't have this in this standard journal, it's, you know, it's of higher or lower quality than candidate B.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That is a great question. So I think what we really look for promotion and promotion and tenure is impact. And we are currently doing our holistic review of our promotion tenure processes and what evidence is there to demonstrate impact. So if there's a preprint, if there are other ways of demonstrating this, it actually doesn't even have to be peer-reviewed publications necessarily. It can be evidence-based protocols that you can show are taken up by other academic medical centers or other practices, and you're making an impact for patient care. There's also social media impact. How many engagements do you have with even interviews that you give and when you talk about your science? So there are a lot of opportunities for that. And we're moving into, as you said, it's an evolving landscape, Jonathan, and we're really looking at that very closely and demonstrating how people do that. In fact, it's interesting. We're talking about for our promotion tenure holistic process, the meeting today, we're putting it together a publication, but we also have the process itself we want to make available to other academic medical centers. And there's nowhere really for it to live. So I'm like, well, it can live on the OFA website and we can see how many people ask for it and we can track how it's being used. So we can track impact that way. So yeah, I agree. There's so many different ways to show how you're contributing to the field, and it's not just impact factor anymore. It's impact. And there's so many ways to look at that. So thank you, Jonathan, for that question. I welcome feedback from faculty as well to this process or to the Office of Faculty Affairs on what you feel could demonstrate impact in your field. And then we share that with the promotion and tenure committees, and then they're able to then use that as context to understand the impact you're making.
I have a quick question.
Oh, thank you, Alex.
No other ones. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm the electronic resources librarian. So I am curious on this topic, just kind of as a general question. A lot of open access that I've seen, especially in terms of, you know, navigating things like the APCs, tend to be more on a departmental or individual level. So just in terms of like your general thoughts, I'm curious to see what you would all think, what you would like to see the institution, you know, on an institutional level, what changes and what advocacy they could implement to kind of, well, advocate for open access on a more institutional level instead of kind of this lower like individual level, or even what roles you would like to see the library play in kind of advocating for greater open access.
So panelists, if there's ways you think that MCW could be more supportive of this, now's your chance to get it on record, or at least for the library to start considering and kind of looking into.
I know it's a very broad general question, but just from a collection standpoint, it's always curious to kind of navigate how we would move from a model of paying for subscriptions and all the current metrics we use to provide access to resources into open access. And I think since there is such a large role that authors play in that, it's just something that I'm interested if anyone has thoughts on it.
I mean, I'm going to take this opportunity. I mean, I've spoken a lot, so I don't want to take all the time, but I will take this opportunity for a shout out to the library, because the MCW library is phenomenal and so supportive. And that's why we have you as part of new faculty orientation. We want everyone to know the resources you provide. So it's still sort of on an individual level that people reach out to the library, for example, for help and guidance on this. I've actually recommended so many people to go and ask you for assistance. Programming like this, for example, is a really wonderful way to then bring this to the fore and then have these conversations and bring awareness to it. I think Dr. Marchant, though, brought up a really key point is, you know, it comes down to funding. So if there was some central funding to support this, even if you apply for it, or, you know, there's some mechanism for it, would be very helpful to help facilitate this, because there's a lot of differences across departments, and or we have some policies in place that can minimize the differences across departments as far as who has the funding to put towards these sorts of things versus the others that don't. So I think that, you know, Jonathan's couch can only be turned over so many times, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I would concur with that. I mean, I think everyone is facing the squeeze. I mean, I think the library is facing a squeeze because I read before the seminar that I think journal subscription rates have like outpaced inflation by, I think it's about 250% over the last 10 years. So I think, you know, libraries are being fleeced. I mean, researchers, if you're publishing 5 or 6 papers a year, it can be $5,000 or $6,000 per paper to pay for open access charges in some journals. So we haven't got the budgets to support that. So I don't know how the free market is going to perhaps drive down these APCs over time. I mean, I think it's unsustainable, and whether there'll be downward price pressure because people aren't doing it. I don't think that the library could afford, I mean, I don't think there's budget to pay APCs for everyone fairly and equitably across the institution. So it's a quandary. I have no solution to that.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm going to share one last slide because preprints were mentioned a number of times. And I just want to let you know that we've got the editor of Research Square coming up September 15th. So she's doing a scholarly communications webinar. So you can ask some of the questions that came up straight to the editor to see what she has to say about them. So she will be here September 15th from maybe it's 11 to 2. I have to make sure the times are right on this slide, but she will be here. And then just highlighting a couple upcoming classes. We've got a class about designing research posters. So if you've got researchers and students in your labs who need to make their posters for their summer research projects, or even conferences and that, tune in for that discussion. And then someone from Awesome will be coming, Dr. Farkas will be coming to talk about the gender gap in research and gender disparities in academic scholarship. So there are some really great upcoming scholarly communications webinars. The last webinar I did about Open Access 101 did mention about institutional repositories and places to deposit your research after it's been published. So, you've got the preprint phase that hasn't yet gone through the peer review process. You publish it, and then you've got a work that sometimes you can work with the journal editors to be able to deposit that on a personal website or a repository somewhere. So MCW currently doesn't have that institutional repository, but that's something that could be advocated for. So that is a space where people could deposit their works. It's not on the journal's website per se, but a copy of the article is placed there. And Sherpa Romeo was brought up. So this is a website you can look at journal by journal to see what their policies are for depositing to a preprint server and then taking a published article and depositing it somewhere else for open access. So if you've got individual articles you're looking at, you can consult that website or talk to the library specifically. I want to thank the panelists. I thought this was a really rich and interesting conversation that we had today. This webinar will be recorded and available on the library website, and I'll be sure to share it up with everybody. I'm really grateful for all of your insight, and I hope that we could do more of these in the future in this sort of model. I'm going to paste in the chat too, one last thing before I stop recording.